Iran's decision to double the cost of gas ignites a wave of violence. The government says it's giving the extra revenue to the poor. But are they just throwing fuel onto the fire of a smoldering economy? I'm Imran Garda, and today on the Newsmakers, we'll look at the political fallout of the rising price of petrol in Iran. It would be hard to imagine one of the world's largest oil producers with yearly exports in the billions suffering under a fuel crisis. But not every country is Iran. Their decision to double the price of petrol and put limits on how much people can buy at any one time had been expected. The anger that followed wasn't. Soon after the protest began, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted to the Iranian people, "The United States hears you, we have your back." It was a carbon copy of his tweet from a year and a half ago, when the U.S. pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. Those sanctions, designed to destroy the oil-rich nation's economy and turn its people against the government, are doing exactly that. All this while the government continues to prop up proxy militias of its neighbors in Lebanon and Iraq, while asking its own people to tighten their belts. Tehran says starting today, the new revenue will go to millions of people in need. So is the government just robbing from the not-so-rich to give to the poor? Haider Abbasi reports.
Sporadic protests have erupted across Iran. Tens of thousands of people are demonstrating against the government. They're angry about a massive increase in fuel prices. Some have blocked roads and trashed banks and shops. Several people have been killed and at least 1,000 arrested since the protests began on Friday. In response, Iran's government has cut internet access. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has described the protesters as hooligans, saying he supports the fuel price hike.
بنابراین منم که صاحب نظر نیستم تو این قضایا. گفتم من صاحب نظر نیستم، لکن اگر سران سه قوه تصمیم بگیرن من حمایت میکنم. من این رو گفتم، حمایتم میکنم. سران قوان نشستن با پشتوانه کارشناسی یه تصمیمی برای کشور گرفتن. باید عمل بشه به اون تصمیم. این یک نکته.
Iran's decision to ration petrol and remove fuel subsidies has caused prices to jump. The government says it wants to use the revenue to pay civil servants' salaries and give cash handouts to poor families. Most of Iran's revenue comes from exporting crude oil. But Tehran has struggled since the US reimposed sanctions following the US withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal. Since then, Iran's economy has fallen into a recession. Its currency has lost 60% of its value since 2018, and the IMF says the economy will shrink 9% by the end of 2019. With no sign of sanctions relief coming from abroad, will Iran be forced to make further unpopular economic decisions at home? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now in London is journalist Nazenin Ansari. She's the managing editor of the Iranian opposition newspaper Kayhan, London. Nazenin, good to have you on the program. Is this about fuel subsidies or about much more than fuel subsidies?
Thank you for inviting me. Certainly the government would like to portray it as a protest against fuel subsidies. But certainly when you look at the symbolism that is being used in demonstrations in the protests, it goes far beyond. We have seen the portraits of Ayatollah Khamenei being burnt down. There have been Iranian flags burnt down in the middle where there's the emblem of the Islamic Republic. There has been even like big rings of Ayatollah Khomeini being made with the writings on it and then being put on fire. The demonstrations, the slogans are all against Mr. Khamenei and the Islamic Republic. So it is not only about fuel protests, it is not only about the fuel. Inflation has been rising for the past 40 years. But at the end of the day, the time is here. And as we see from the reaction of the Islamic Republic, by shutting down the internet, by not allowing access to information, but by not allowing footage of what is really happening to get out, they would like to control the information and to divide the rising voices in the international community.
Okay, so Nazenin, yes, they restricted the internet. Yes, there has been a crackdown. People have died on the streets. All of that is true, but wouldn't you say that if we look at it from the long view and the perspective especially of the Trump administration as it pulled out of the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, the purpose of sanctions was to squeeze the Iranian economy, to get the Iranian people to turn against the Iranian government. So with all of that in mind, the leadership isn't cooking up a conspiracy when they say the Americans are involved here. The Americans are involved in the sense that the sanctions are working and the people are turning against this government because of the sanctions, right?
Well, it is more than that. Sanctions, yes, sanctions are hurting. But the leaders of the Islamic Republic at every single juncture had a choice of whether to divert the funds that were coming into the country towards increasing the quality of life of Iranians or siphoning it off to Iraq, to Lebanon, to Yemen to support their forces there. I take one example of medicine shortage. Why is it that they complain at times that, oh, because of sanctions, Iranians are short of medicine, but still they can find enough medical equipment and enough medicine to export to Iraq and other neighboring countries where they are active.
Okay, fair argument. Let's go to Tehran, where Foad Izadi joins us. He's a political science professor at the University of Tehran. I understand the connection is a little bit shaky, so I hope it holds. Foad, good to have you on the program. Doesn't Nazenin make a good point that, yes, the sanctions do hurt the Iranian economy, but that hasn't stopped Iran from its empire building in Iraq and Lebanon and elsewhere? If the sanctions are hurting, don't you focus on your own people first?
Yes, I think that's a valid argument that you need to focus on your people first. And Iran's regional influence is designed to do that. We remember what happened when Iran could not have proper relations with the Iraqi government. We had a person like Saddam Hussein that gained power in Iraq and then attacked Iran. That resulted in 8 years of war, and many Iranians and Iraqis were killed because of that war. So that gave Iranian government a lesson, and the lesson was that in order to make sure that Iranian people are safe, they need to have a regional policy that makes sure that enemies of Iran are not able to use neighboring countries to attack Iran.
Nazenin, okay.
Okay,
Foad, let me get a response from Nazenin. Certainly.
Has a logic behind
there's a bit of a delay here as well, so my apologies. Nazenin, come in. I'm going to get you two to respond to each other because we have about 3.5 minutes left on this segment. So, Nazenin, come in. Your response.
Yes, well, I mean, certainly Iran's, the Islamic Republic's posturing in the foreign policy has been, and its excuse, not to allow the crisis that is taking place elsewhere in the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, to get to Iran. In a way, they justified their policy in Syria of increasing aid, of sending Revolutionary Guards, of sending their other supporters to Syria as to keep Iran safe. Obviously, this strategy, if they keep saying that it is foreign power, has failed. And that is one thing that we see different this time around from other times when Iran was going through protests. The Islamic Republic's strategy has failed. Next, Mr. Rouhani, last time, in the last couple of weeks, has announced that he's going to give 2 budgets to the parliament, to offer 2 budgets not based on oil revenues, but based on tourism. At a time when the Revolutionary Guards are taking dual nationals as hostage, do you think there will be tourism in Iran?
Foad Izadi.
And this is,
okay,
all
certainly.
of these are wrong rationality and misplaced priorities.
Foad, if Nazenin is right and the priorities are misplaced, do you agree that the government is losing legitimacy in the eyes of the people because so many people are out on the streets?
There are three types of people on the streets as we speak. We have people who oppose the government because of economic hardship. We have people who oppose the government because of political disagreements. And then we have a third group that is linked with terrorist organizations, MKO, monarchists, other organizations. And these are designed, these groups, the third group, are basically shooting at the police. As you saw in the footage that you had, they're burning banks, they're burning public places. These are not ordinary citizens. These are not peaceful protesters. So we have the Iranian opposition sitting in London and using the money that they get from the Saudi government, the money they get from the US government, the money they get from the Israeli government to create difficulties for Iran.
Let me get a final response from
the Iranian government is weak and they're going to fall.
So,
and they have been saying that for the last 40 years.
Nazenin, are you getting money from the Saudis and the Americans and the Israelis, and that's why you have this perspective?
Our publication goes back to 1941 in Iran, and we have been continuing based on the support of our community and our own people. There has been no government funding, international government funding, foreign government backing, or Islamic Republic backing for us. That's number one. Number two, it is that the protests are continuing in Iran, and we do not have access. No international observer has access to Iran. If the Iranian government would open the internet and allow the footage to coming out, we wouldn't be hearing there are reports that there are helicopters shooting down on people in Shiraz. We have to verify this. And the only way we can verify this is for the internet to be opened.
Right.
And I am very happy that that Dr. Shireen Ebadi, the Nobel Prize winner, has started a petition asking the United Nations and as well European governments to really urge the Iranian government to open the internet and stop the brutal crackdown on the protesters.
Okay,
it's enough.
Right, Nazenin and Foad, this will be our introduction to this latest round of protests and all the ramifications. We'd love to have you back on the program soon, but I've got to move on to Sri Lanka now. So let me thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. A controversial former defense secretary accused of war crimes and human rights violations has been sworn in as Sri Lanka's new president. Nicknamed the Terminator, 70-year-old Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who's from one of the country's most powerful political families, took the oath at a Buddhist temple alongside his brother, a former president and many say future prime minister. The pair led operations that crushed the Tamil Tiger separatist movement and ended a 26-year civil war, but they stand accused of using brute force to do so. Rajapaksa insists he will serve all Sri Lankans regardless of race or religion. But will the man seen as a hardline Sinhalese nationalist make good on those promises? Well, joining me now from Kerala, Sri Lanka is Rajiva Wijesinha. He was an advisor on reconciliation to former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. In London, we're joined by Jananayagam. She's an activist and director of the international non-profit organization Together Against Genocide. And in Colombo, we have political analyst Rasika Jayakody. He's also a youth member of the Prime Minister's ruling United National Party. Good to have you all on the program. John, let me come to you in London. We've had Rajapaksa appeal to Tamils and Muslims and say that I'm going to lead all Sri Lankans. Are you willing to give him that opportunity?
Yeah, I think that the people would give him an opportunity, but unfortunately, he's not credible in that promise because he has in the past been shown to be very vindictive And although he has said that, I'm not even sure that the promise was meant in that way. He was very clear in his inauguration address that he acknowledged that he came to power solely through the Sinhala vote. He said that I can come to power, and I've done so with the Sinhala vote. And he mentioned that the minorities, the Tamils and the Muslims, had overwhelmingly rejected him. And I think, to me, I read that as somewhat of a threat, actually. And also in terms of the way he did his inauguration, he did it in Anuradhapura, which is a historic, symbolic location where the Sinhala king Duttagamanu, historically, that he models himself after, vanquished the Tamils. And in fact, that also was a historical genocide. Thousands, millions of Tamils were killed, and it's in the holy book of the Sinhalese. So it's a very symbolic gesture that he made. So I'm not sure how much one could believe what he would say.
Rajiva, this is a president for the Sinhala majority and not for the minorities. That's what a lot of people, beyond just what John said, that's what a lot of people believe. Do you disagree with that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think we've got to see what will happen. And I think, when you're faced with people like John, who really misrepresent history appallingly, millions killed in the 1st century BC, I think this is the sort of figure that is designed to create tension and opposition. It's complete nonsense. And as she jolly well ought to know, the final combat was decided in the case of Duttagamanu and the Tamil king Elara by a single combat between them. And of course, the new king absolutely respected the body of his much older opponent, Elara. So, there are different ways of interpreting history. You can interpret it in terms of continuous warfare, or you can interpret it in terms of efforts to bring people together. I would like to think that Gotabaya will try. I think he made the point very clearly that although he'd been voted for by the Sinhala Buddhists predominantly, what this really meant was he doesn't have to engage in the horse trading that his predecessors of various sorts did engage in. I think we need to see exactly what will happen, but certainly the language he has been using, and indeed the language of his principal opponent, Sajid Premadasa, who did get a great many of the Tamil votes, has been conciliatory and a move towards the future. I think we have to hope for the best, certainly not what happened in the last 5 years, which is a complete lack of development for the Tamil, the Muslim and the Sinhala people.
So, Rasika, a lot of people talk about that house of cards, the Sirisena, Wickramasinghe, Rajapaksa triangle of political chaos over a period of time. A lot of people saw it damaging the political system. Now there's an opportunity for a fresh start with the new president. But do minorities have reason to be fearful? John had mentioned some of those fears. When somebody is a Muslim Sri Lankan or somebody a Tamil Sri Lankan, do they have legitimate fears that maybe this new leader won't fully lead them?
I think when Mr. Rajapaksa delivered his first address to the nation after taking oath as the president, he sent mixed signals. Yes, he said that he said he was aware that he could get elected only with the support of the Sinhala votes. At the same time, he said, nevertheless, he reached out to the Tamil and minority communities, and he asked for their help, and it didn't elicit a positive response. But he said, as the president of Sri Lanka, I appeal to you again, work with me. So he sent mixed signals. However, we have to come to the realization that ultra-nationalist elements were instrumental in Mr. Rajapaksa's election campaign. They were very loud, and so that element cannot be ruled out. At the same time, as the president of Sri Lanka, Mr. Rajapaksa has a responsibility to ensure that he serves all communities, that he addresses the needs of all communities, including Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslim communities, and make sure that he acts as the president of all, not as the president of the Sinhalese community, and that's his primary responsibility.
So Rajiva, we have the history of people wanting this man who's now the president in the dock. They want him on trial for alleged war crimes, right? When we look back at the civil war against the Tamil Tigers. But beyond that as well, with the Easter terror attacks, there's a particular temperature and a particular political atmosphere in Sri Lanka right now. Would you agree that that political atmosphere means that politicians tend to go with a more Buddhist nationalist, pro-Sinhalese flow in order to get votes, and that's where Sri Lankan politics is at right now because of everything that preceded it?
I think one of the problems that we have is this insistence on Sinhala Buddhist. If you remember, the biggest victims of the April massacres, which were by a tiny group of Muslim extremists, the vast majority of Muslims in Sri Lanka had indeed brought to the attention of the government at the time the extremism that these few Wahhabi-style extremists were engaged in, and the government did nothing. The biggest victims were the Catholics. And I think you have to remember that Gotabaya Rajapaksa won healthy majorities in what is known as the Catholic belt as well. So certainly there were concerns about security. I think it is very important that with Gotabaya Rajapaksa's victory, there's a distinct sense that we will go back to the absence of terror that we were lucky enough to achieve in 2009. And it was absolutely horrifying to most Sri Lankans of all communities, including the Tamils. Many Tamils suffered from the Muslim extremists.
So let's get a response from John.
And I think that sense of security is national.
Okay, so John, he said that he wants to rebuild the security arm of the state. As we heard from Rajiva, a lot of Sri Lankans want safety and security, and this is their man to do so. What do you think?
Before I respond to that, I actually want to respond to something that Mr. Wijesinha said earlier about the Mahavamsa and the modeling of Gotabaya's regime after Dutugemenu. I'm not here to talk about ancient history. I was simply talking about the current ideology of the Holy Book in the Mahavamsa, which really does say that millions of beings were killed, but their lives were worth less than one being because they were non-believers. And this is what I mean by supremacist ideology, which basically says that Sri Lanka belongs to the Sinhalese as an island.
So we're not debating the death tolls. Okay, got the symbolism. Go ahead.
We're not. But let me just come back to the terrorism question. So let me just go back to the terrorism question. So I think that the issue with the Muslims was that after the war, they became the new internal enemy, and there were already riots, and their businesses were burned down in Kandy and Digana and in many areas in the south. So I think that to blame all of the rise in tension only on that one incident, which was a terrorist incident, is wrong, because they had already become the new enemy, and Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the Rajapaksa family had promoted that ethnic breakdown and the religious fault lines. They had promoted that.
Rasika, is the biggest enemy going to be the failing economy? The man's inheriting a government that's in a sort of debt trap to China. Is that a big mess that needs to be sorted out, can he?
Of course. Now, Mr. Rajapaksa, I think one of his primary responsibilities is to ensure that Sri Lanka comes out of the current debt trap. And I can't really envision how he can. I mean, at this point, I can't envision how he's going to achieve that. Sri Lanka got into this debt trap due to various reasons, and I think both the governments should take responsibility for that. I mean, the government that existed before 2015, the government that was run by Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa and his cabinet, and then the government that came into power in January 2015. The Sirisena Wickremesinghe government. I think both governments should accept responsibility to the current state of the Sri Lankan economy. Going forward, Mr. Rajapaksa talked about pro-business policies, business-friendly regulations, and accelerating economic activity. And he also promised drastic tax reductions. So I really don't know how he will put these things into practice given the current state of Sri Lankan economy. So I think it's going to be very interesting. At the same time, I think responding to one of the issues that was discussed before, I think one of the key reasons behind Mr. Rajapaksa's ascension to power was the growing concerns about the defense establishment, which particularly happened after Easter Sunday attacks. So that also needs to be discussed.
Okay, John, I'm going to give you the final word here. We have less than a minute on the program. Do you trust him? I know you don't trust him in terms of minorities. Do you trust him to revive the economy?
I think the economy is linked to the human rights record of Sri Lanka because that's just the way it is. And I think that the issue is that internationally he has been such a difficult figure. The UN has found him alleged war crimes against him, crimes against humanity, genocide. And I think he just is so controversial. It's very difficult to see how he will take Sri Lanka into the international.
Okay, we'll revisit Sri Lanka. Okay, Rajiva, listen, I've got 20 seconds until we're off here. You are cordially invited to come back on the program. We'll revisit Sri Lanka in a few weeks' time, Mr. Wijesinha. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're completely out of time. I've got to move on. I thank you, Rajiva, Jan, and Rasika. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.